Good afternoon and welcome back to Dynamics 365 Finance and Operation, and we are continuing to learn about the human resource module. And in today's video, we're going to talk a little bit about labor unions and bank account disbursement. So last video talked about how you assign a bank account information, and we emphasized on routing numbers, so what that is all about. And it is a very crucial and valuable field to understand in order for you to actually communicate effectively the usage of it to your client. So today, let's just dig right into the human resource module. Right underneath the workers, we'll go into employees, we'll select an employee, and we'll just, in theory, talk about what these guys are. So bank account disbursements, it's basically, a table with all the information that is applicable to that employee. For instance, if I would have created a bank account, it would have listed the bank account here, and then the idea here is actually for a disbursement. So in finance and operation, unfortunately, you cannot split the amount that you want to send out to payroll. However, this is basically, even though it's a disbursement bank account, table, you could say, it gives you a wrong impression that you can put a percentage or an amount for that matter. In this case, the best way to go around that is, to establish a extension. If you want to split the amount that you want to send out to your employee's bank account based on different bank accounts on a percentage level. So you would have to create an extension for that. This actually does take into account the actual amount, but to what extent are you going to continue to change the amount? And that's the issue with this table. And that's why I wouldn't prefer you to even bring up the idea to your client where you would say that a functionality about disbursements actually exists, because it's not applicable, not practical, and it just doesn't make sense to propose something like that. So I would advise you to actually have a sort of customization done if it's absolutely required as part of the requirement from the client. Labor unions, I have done implementations of labor unions, and it's a very, very complicated implementation. Finance and operation does not account for labor union sort of rules and regulations, you could say. So the handbook that you may have read or you may know about if you were ever working as a labor union employee, it's almost like a 200-page rules, number of rules, or like 200-page worth of rules, and it's very complicated. So to give you an example, in order to simply go from one or get a promotion, for instance, there's a big process to it, and that process is not embedded into finance and operation because it's not targeted towards labor unions. One thing to note, of course, you can always customize it, but those are very difficult customizations. Another example that I want to give you is the seniority calculation. If you ever got a chance to actually read that handbook, then you would realize the complexity, the amount of information that goes in order to calculate the seniority of that labor union employee. So imagine that. But in this case, labor unions is just a reference point when they became a union employee, when it would end, for instance, and that's all there is to it. There's nothing more than that in terms of the union piece. And commission tractions and sales group, I personally haven't used it. If there is some form of a commission involved or sales involved, I would implement the sales and marketing module rather than having that information down here. So I think it's irrelevant. In my years of HR experience in implementations, I've never used a commission tractions or transactions or even sales group for that matter. So let's start talking about the payroll piece. So while we're at it, in terms of payroll does not exist in finance and operation. You may have heard me say that a while back in my introductory videos. So this tab is more or less misleading because payroll, at least in Canada, it does not exist. The module does not exist. In the US, it used to at some point, but only pieces of it, and they are getting rid of that as well. So you would have to simply integrate payroll with a third-party provider, whether you are in Canada, US, or more or less in even in any other country, because finance and operation does not have a payroll module. So all of that is actually not applicable at all to you. And if you want to know more about it, give me a comment and I'll talk a little bit about these fields and what they mean. I think it'll be from a general knowledge perspective, because as a payroll provider or someone who's an expert in payroll, you would be talking to them quite often in terms of this implementation. So as an HR and payroll, they kind of go hand in hand. So those two consultants are always going to be talking to each other, because you're going to be sending a lot of information from the HR to the payroll, and the payroll has to configure based on the rules and earning codes and accruals and whatnot. They kind of take into that account and create a pay statement, for instance, and send it out to the bank itself. So with that, I'll leave you to exploring a little bit more on the finance and operation piece in this HR module. We'll talk a little bit about benefits in the next video, and then we'll continue to talk about all these tabs up until the commerce, and then we'll start talking about the configuration pieces of the different modules and how they tie into what we just learned from a user perspective.